Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's centenary event. For the past 100 years, the Tavistock and Portman have been at the forefront of exploring mental health and well-being. From attachment theory to infant observation and beyond, our ideas have led to changes in care, education, and how we work. Our centenary festival celebrates our history and explores contemporary issues. Tonight, we're focusing on work and well-being, and this week we focus on organisation and systems. And now I'll hand over to our host for tonight, Chris Caldwell.
Thank you, Glenn. Good evening, everybody. So on International Women's Day 2021, welcome everybody to the second of our two workshops. And we're delighted that you've chosen to join us today. So my name is Chris Caldwell. I'm the Director of Nursing and System Workforce Development at Tavistock and Portman. And that means that as well as providing professional leadership for the nursing profession across the Trust, I also lead the Trust's growing portfolio of activities to support workforce development in mental health and well-being, and to support mental health in the workplace, both in the public and the commercial sector. Last week, our focus was on individuals and teams, and our discussion focused on how we prepare and support individuals and teams to ensure that people can thrive at work. This week, the focus is on organisation and system level. Inevitably, last week's discussion strayed into the wider territory, and I'm sure we'll also talk about the individual response tonight. Both sessions stand on their own, and we're excited to see where today's workshop will take us. This is a workshop and we intend it to be interactive. The format will provide the opportunity to hear three speakers who share their perspective on their work. After a short break, we'll move into a panel discussion where we encourage you to reflect on what you've heard and share your reflections and questions with the panel and with your own delegates using the chat function and through asking questions. The panel will be chaired by my colleague Brian Rock, the Director of Education and Training and Postgraduate Dean here at the TAVI, and he will introduce you to the panel members who will be joined by myself and the three speakers. As you listen, do jot down your thoughts and questions. As Glenn mentioned in the introduction, the workshop is part of the centenary celebrations. The Tavistock and Portman has a 100-year history of clinical practice, teaching, research and lobbying focused on well-being at work. Indeed, the clinic in Tavistock Square had its origins in revolutionary practice using talking therapies to work with World War I veterans suffering from so-called shell shock. Of particular interest to me is the work in the 1950s of Isabel Menzies Live and her research and writings about attrition from nursing in the NHS, linked to the structure of work processes, research which remains equally relevant to working practices in the NHS in 2021. This work and the psychodynamic and systemic theories that underpin both the nursing and veterans work, along with our subsequent work, now underpin our practice in the Trust, including our clinical work, teaching, training, organisational development and strategic policy work. Even before the current pandemic, according to a major report in the UK government in 2017, the UK faced a significant mental health challenge at work, with a large annual cost to employers of between 33 billion and 42 billion pounds, with over half of that cost coming from presenteeism, where individuals are at work but less productive because of poor mental health and general dissatisfaction, with additional costs coming from sickness absence and staff turnover. The cost of poor mental health to government is between 24 billion and 27 billion. Deloitte's analysis of the case studies where investments have been made in improving mental health show a consistently positive return on investment, a finding which is bolstered by a number of academic studies. In the NHS, the cost of employee mental ill health accounts for an average of £1,774 to £2,174 per employee per year. This is before we add in the costs of presenteeism and attrition, both from training and from the work. In 2017, the Trust commissioned, as part of its national contract with the NHS, was commissioned to establish the National Workforce Skills Development Unit to support the Health Education England to address what it termed the greatest challenge facing the NHS: workforce resilience, capacity and wellbeing. The framework draws on a wide range of theories, ideas and practices, many of which are widely used at the TAVI and which you'll be hearing more about this evening. The framework is entitled Workforce Stress and the Supportive Organisation, and it helps organisations to support staff by taking time to explore the impact of what is impacting on staff wellbeing. And it shifts the thinking away from how can we make our staff more resilient to what do organisations need to do to support their staff and reduce reliance on individual resilience. What can organisations and systems do is the focus of this evening. And with no more ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers for the first part of the event. Firstly, we're going to have Jenny Mcshannon. Jenny is an organisation consultant at Tavistock Consulting, working with a range of public and private sector organisations. And you can see her full bio, along with everybody else's, in the Eventbrite. But Jenny has over 20 years of senior leadership experience in the voluntary sector, before she came to Tavistock Consulting. And in the organisation, she's a faculty within the Masters in Consulting and Leading in the organisation, and is a director of the Tavistock's Executive Coaching Programme. Angela Kaur Begum originally went to art college and left art college to start her nurse training over 20 years ago. And since qualifying, she's had the privilege of working as a mental health nurse in a range of different settings with children, families and parents. And she's been at the Tavistock Portman since 2011, where she's now working as a visiting lecturer and also in our wellbeing service, supporting organisations through a whole system approach to understanding wellbeing in the organisation. She's also throughout the years maintained her art practice and is currently training as an art psychotherapist. Our third speaker is Lydia Hartland-Rowe. Lydia is the Workforce Wellbeing Lead at the Tavistock and Portman and the clinical lead for the AD Wellbeing programme. She trained as an orchestral musician and then as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So in our speakers, you've got a range of experience, and I'm going to hand over now to Jenny to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here this evening and to think together with you and with my other trust colleagues about probably one of my favourite subjects, organisations and systems, and to think about how they impact on us as individuals, as group members, as a society, and of course how society, groups and individuals impact on organisations and systems. A very dynamic relationship, and one that has fascinated me all my working life. So a little bit of my work and what brings me here this evening. I'm an organisational consultant at Tavistock Consulting, as Chris has outlined, and it's part of the trust. And if you work or study or come to the clinic, you may have passed but not really registered Tavistock Consulting. We're based in a small shop front near the clinic, and we can be easily missed. But we have been around for over 25 years, drawing on all the applied research of the Tavistock into leadership, groups and organisational life. And our work is wholly focused on supporting organisations to function more effectively as a system and as part of a system. And what I mean by being more effective is that organisations are able to achieve their task and their purpose to, save lives through renal medicine, to care for vulnerable adults or children, or to develop and produce the products and services we all need in our lives to keep ourselves fed, our homes running, and our infrastructure going. But what I also mean by being more effective is that organisations are able to achieve this with the sustained input of their most important resources, their staff, because sustained input requires a robust and healthy workforce. So when we think about wellbeing, we're always looking at it beyond the individual and looking at it from an organisational and system perspective. We think of optimum organisational wellbeing as leading to engaged and productive staff, adequate and well-managed resources, the ability to withstand the inevitable change that will happen both within and outside the boundary, and more, of course. As we start this subject tonight, I'd like you to bring to mind your best ever experience of work, a time when you felt that you were thriving, achieving, learning, when your work had meaning and was most enjoyable. What was it, or is it, might be your current role, that made it so great? Is it simply the place where you were in your own life, your personal circumstances, and your internal sense of well-being? Or was it also the purpose of your work, your customers or your patients or clients, the team you were working with, colleagues and mentors, the quality of leadership or followership, the clarity of your role, or your relationships with other teams and services? Was it the support that you had for doing your work at home, friends and family, or maybe even the money and reward? Now, not claiming anything, let's be real, whatever time you're thinking of it now or in the past, it's unlikely that you had all those ducks in a row. There's no perfect workplace. But what I'm trying to convey is that our best experience of work is usually connected not just to our own internal state of well-being, but the successful interplay of all the different aspects of organisational life. And as such, healthy functioning at work cannot just be focused on the well-being of individuals, but on the system as a whole. So of course, conversely, our worst experience of work usually comes from some disjuncture or lack of alignment within the system. I don't know, I love the patients, but the team is a mess. Our leader doesn't know what they're doing and it's total chaos. We're great, but that other team is useless and making our work more difficult. What we do as an organisation is really important, but we're always told that we're doing the wrong thing or that we're failing or that we're not good enough. And if any of this is familiar to you, you'll know just how much stress it can cause and the impact on one's own emotional and mental well-being and on one's team and colleagues. So what is our approach to helping leaders and teams optimise the conditions for a healthy organisation? Well, there's so much to focus on, but I have just a couple of ideas to share. Firstly, for us, is to keep people in touch with the full range of emotions that come with the nature of the work. Whatever it is we do brings reward, but the nature of what we do also generates particular anxieties. So in healthcare, it might be compassion, pity, or maybe some more difficult feelings such as resentment. In financial services, it might be different, perhaps some anxiety around failure, some excitement or shame. And when these emotions and anxieties at work get squashed and suppressed within the organisation, they can't be contained and they're left in this raw, unprocessed state. And the effect is that they surface in different and usually unhelpful ways, and they affect team or departmental functioning. I was trying to think of an example, and something that we've been doing recently is supporting a unit in a general hospital to improve their working relationships. And there have been a number of recent deaths in patients and various inquests and investigations. And this experience had really split the team into defensive silos, and the consultants and nurses really blaming each other and unable to work together. And when we met with them, there was so much anger and aggression, and it was all waged through these formal complaints and horrible gossip and stonewalling and all sorts of difficult behaviour. And many were feeling very isolated and angry and very stressed. So our first task in working with them was simply to help them connect with and acknowledge to each other the emotions that come with their work, and to see how some of their defensive behaviours were employed to avoid the pain and shame that comes when a patient dies or a mistake is made. It might not sound like much, but the outcome of even these initial conversations has been the start of some greater openness between them and a more collegiate and less stressed day-to-day experience. So while our task was not explicitly to improve well-being, by helping them connect with and better manage the emotions at work, they are starting to feel a little bit less stressed and more supported, not by us, but by each other. And that's made a real difference. And the second aspect of our approach is linked, and I think it's a really significant element in thinking about well-being in organisations, And it's to think about how the not coping can get projected into particular individuals and groups within an organisation. We were asked by a hospital to provide a wellbeing programme to recently qualified nurses on the acute assessment unit. And it was because so many were leaving within 18 months. And I know this is something we're all very familiar with. But they were leaving in numbers that left the hospital completely crippled in terms of staffing. And would we run a programme of support for these particular nurses? Well, of course we could, but our first question was to ask not just about the nurses, but also about the context in which they were working. What else was going on in the system? And what they described was an incredible increase in pace, patient complexity and relentlessness of the work that longer serving nurses could cope with, but newly qualified nurses couldn't. So what we proposed to the Director of Nursing was really perhaps that all nurses on the unit were experiencing high levels of stress and burnout, but that this was being conveniently located in the newly qualified and generally younger nurses and unconsciously denied by the older, longer serving nurses. And our suggestion was that a systemic intervention, including all bands right up to matron level, would have more of an impact on retention than just focusing on newly qualified nurses. This actually resonated with them, and we did have a rare opportunity to work in depth with the whole system over time. It was definitely a challenge to engage everyone, and reasonably there was a lot of resistance and suspicion to start. But over time they came together, and the outcome, which did actually get evaluated externally, was the extent to which nurses felt less stressed and better able to cope. And importantly, and to my opening point, really, the evaluation demonstrated that it was the improvements in working together across the different bands and roles that made the difference, not just to retention, but to their well-being and their capacity and ability to manage. So, as well as thinking up the level to where the perceived problem is in relation to well-being, what this really highlighted, and I think is crucial for all thinking about well-being, is about how difference is unconsciously used by the system. I think we must always be asking ourselves what it is that we might be projecting onto those who are different to hold and express for us as a whole organisation. And in doing so, and when we do that, they become the focus of attention, either the problem to be supported or the problem to be blamed and managed out. Sort of like they're the problem, if we can sort them out, we're fixed. Or if we can move them out, we're fixed. But if the problem is systemic, then the not coping will just get picked up by some other group within the system. In this instance, it was by the younger, newly qualified nurses, but it could be picked up elsewhere at another time. The difference can be used, and it's not just in role or length of service, but also by way of difference in terms of race and gender and class, disability and more, in the unconscious processes which impact on our efficacy of work and our overall well-being. What I've described so far is sort of thinking about well-being as a systemic relational issue, and certainly that's something I look forward to your thoughts on later on in our evening. But we are also curious about the impact of structures and processes in well-being, and I learned this really from my own experience. Before becoming a consultant, I was the chief exec of a membership charity building organisational capacity and engaging in policy and politics in the UK and Ireland. And when I took over, it was in a bit of a crisis. There were funding worries, and the relationships with its members and its key stakeholders were really pretty dire. And I made some internal improvements to rebuild the team. And with their amazing effort and with the support of the board, we turned the tanker and the organisation got back on its feet. Relationships were with funders, with members, with our partner agencies within and across the community were really thriving, and we were all very exhilarated and by our growth and by our success. However, my staff survey came in and it came as a real shock. Performance was exceptional. Everyone loved the job, but people were exhausted, and actually it was starting to have a negative impact on performance. And what I had failed to pay attention to was the need to concurrently expand the scaffold within the organisation to support the growing work that we were doing within the wider system and all these amazing projects that we had on the go. It was completely unsustainable, and I had to really take my attention away back from the wider system enough to attend to the well-being of staff through updated structures within the organisation. But in my role as, you know, it was a small organisation, but in the executive role, it was a bit like trying to pat my head and rubbing my stomach, thinking about the wider system and also thinking about the internal system. I would say we often think of conflict in organisations as usually relational, you know, that it's usually considered interpersonal and character driven. The obstreperous difficult individuals or the teams unwilling to collaborate or concede or protecting the boundaries around their organisation. But structural factors are also often at the root of conflict in organisations, and of course, whether or not you're involved directly or just around it, conflict is a really significant source of stress in organisation and certainly affects everyone's well-being and of course the service. And it could be that in terms of being linked to structures and processes, that roles are unclear and cause conflict and competition on the boundary, or maybe a lack of strategic overview and governance that sets teams up in competition with each other. So I would say it's as important to think about the structural as much as the relational factors when seeking to build organisational resilience. And I think that we overlook the impact of poor structures at our peril. So, I mean, just a couple of examples that came to mind when I was thinking about organisational systems and how we think about well-being at a systemic level. But I also wanted to think about the work that we do and some of the limits of our ability to intervene, to provide interventions, or for people in organisations that are leading them and thinking about well-being, the sort of limits of intervention. The system always has a boundary, and support to teams and organisations is limited to where this boundary is set. What level of the system are we able to work with, and support is always different. So, for example, in our intervention with the nurses, we looked at well-being as a systemic intervention, and the boundary of this intervention was still limited. Of course, we were not able to impact on the difficult relationship between A&E and the assessment unit. We're not able to address the responsive hospital management to complaints from patient families, or indeed the societal projections into the NHS and the expectations that nobody should die and everything should be perfect and great. The system level change was only really possible within the boundary of the nursing team and within that unit. So of course we can help them think about and get perspective on the wider system. So I suppose to finish, in a recent coaching session, actually last week, a clinical director said to me, resilience, it's becoming a religion, and we know that it can become politicized. If you were more resilient, you could cope with these impossible circumstances. But what we hope for in our work, and I suppose what I hope to have got across this evening, is that we can support resilience at a more systemic and organisational level by thinking more about the well-being of the whole system and not just focusing on where we think the problem group or department is. And if we keep in mind the need to support people to manage the emotions that come with the nature of the work, and if we think about both the relational and the structural factors which support organisation resilience and well-being. So it's got a couple of thoughts for me to open up the session and to start our conversation this evening. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Lydia and Angela.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Jenny. So we got some feedback last week that what was preferred was for people to be able to sort of speak or relate lightly to their notes, as Jenny just did. But I'm actually going to read my contribution because it was the only way that I could make sure I didn't take up too much time, because we want the focus to be more on my colleague Angela Bagham. Now, I'm mentioning that because it's a practical decision. but it's also a small example of what's always around in team, system, and organizational life. As Freud and Bion recognized, the need to balance individual needs and desires with the needs of the group. And in working with a wider system, which is what I'll be talking about, it's still there. How can a part of the system, like the Tavistock, both be itself, be its best, follow its ethos and values, and still work in a way that has the interests of the system at heart and which respects a wide range of experiences and perspectives? So I want to talk about working in and for the Tavistock as part of a system, connecting with and collaborating with other organizations in relation to workforce well-being. Alongside colleagues from the 2 other mental health trusts in North Central London, we're coordinating the work of a centrally funded mental health and wellbeing hub. Now we're tasked with responding to the needs of NHS and social care staff in our geographical area, in our case, 80,000 staff working in multiple organizations in relation to the impact of the pandemic. Well, the work has been energizing, interesting, frustrating, a source of pride, disappointing, creative. In other words, a huge challenge to create something new in a new set of relationships in a climate of change. It's a bit like a group of people working on an ongoing, unfinished painting at the same time as trying to frame it. Well, some things do exist. We've created a website with increasing interactive possibilities, including the beginnings of pathways into clinical services. And we have a growing resource of staff working out into the system. We've used the phrase to be psychologically absorbent, to be ready to understand what's needed at a system level. So we're interested in finding out through what they do, which is to make links, listen, and respond, to what we hear about what individuals, teams, and organizations need in the context of the psychological health and emotional well-being of staff in the climate of COVID. Now, we're working in the context of uncertainty and also in a climate of high anxiety about the suffering of the workforce that at times pushes all of us into working at a speed that doesn't allow for thought or a grasping for results and certainty. So it's hard sometimes to hold on to the need to hold steady and maintain confidence when something needs time to grow and develop, and at the same time be ready to be flexible and adaptive. Well, there are a few things I just want to highlight about this experience so far of working with a system, within a system, in the context of a task that's so closely associated with psychological distress. One is the fact that we live and work in a context of change, sometimes growth and development, sometimes catastrophic change. As Chris said, and as Jenny spoke to, we think a lot in our work about organizational resilience rather than it being something that's located in the individual. And one key aspect of resilience is the capacity to adapt. So for the Tavistock and our organizational colleagues, this terrible unfolding global event has meant that we've adapted to how we work as a system. We've had to change, as well as imperatives for change to work more as a system coming from within our wider political and policy center. But in some ways, as I think Chris commented on at the beginning, all of this work takes the Tavistock also back to its roots, with the effort then to respond to a social crisis in the form of men damaged and traumatized by their experiences during the First World War. Something else that's come to the fore in the work so far is the ongoing struggle to learn from experience, being ready to look honestly at what we're doing, face the pain of doing something new, and learn from the gap between what we thought we might do and what we find ourselves doing, where it works, where it doesn't, where we need to learn. Our focus as a society on the gaps and inequities in relation to the impact of COVID-19 on people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, and our need to find ways to work with the system to provide recognition and support for their experience as NHS and social care staff has been sharpened. Another necessary and painful change coming from the experiences of the past year with a long way to go. There's also something broadly in the work we're doing as a system about learning to tolerate work in progress, the imperfect, and the anxiety that comes with not knowing how we'll manage to do what we need and want to do, bearing the gap between the ideal and the reality, and trying to understand it and change what can be changed. And there's a way in which, working across a system, good intentions can shift from where they are locally to how they're received some distance away. So it's how we manage that gap too. In all of this, I've been seeing and trying to reflect with help on the power of unconscious and conscious communication that informs emotional experience on a systemic level. And this reflection in company is as important working as a system level as it is for individuals and for teams. Well, one of the things we've been recognizing and trying to think about within the hub is the enormous push in the wider system to treat individuals. And while there's absolutely no doubt that there's a need for people who need individual psychological help in relation to their experiences of the pandemic, they should get access to it. And that's something I absolutely recognize from within my clinical identity. It also feels at times that the pressure in this direction is partly a reaction against the pain of knowing about the scope of suffering and about what has been lost by all of us. It also risks missing the potential and the impact that organizations and teams can have in just the ways Jenny was describing, by providing protective and even preventive environments and the power of the group. We've also seen ways in which the work that we're trying to support gets into the hub. That is, the experience of those impacted in their working roles and in their lives as NHS and social care staff, working often very closely to people who are ill or who have died, that the impact of that gets into our work on an emotional level. So we can have experiences of feeling that what we do is a drop in the ocean, that it isn't possible, that we can't make a difference. And then we swing out of that and again feel determined that we can make a little bit of a difference and that even a drop in the ocean is a bit more than the ocean was before. And we often wonder about the extent to which some of those experiences and feelings might come close to what many people working in both frontline and other roles feel about the course of the pandemic, and how unstoppable that course has felt to be, and how hard at times it's felt to feel that the work that we do has value and can really change something or help something. Finally, the work of the hub means managing and working beyond feelings of competition and the pull to stay with what and who you know. So working on behalf of the wider system at a time when in the public sector, we are all as individuals, teams and organizations anxious about how valued we are and how we can maintain balance and strength and still take the risk to work with other organizations with whom in other ways we might feel we are in competition. It's a very difficult balance to maintain, but it feels absolutely central to the work. Well, one thing that's happened in the past year is that the work on behalf of the system in the shape of the hub and everything that's gone into it is that we've needed to try and also protect the work of the Ad Wellbeing Service. Now, the Ad Wellbeing Service is still a young project needing energy and care. We often talk about it being a bit like a startup. And suddenly this startup needed to make space as if, when the hub came along, as if it needed to make space for a much larger organization needing to draw on exactly the same resources. And there are times when that works well and times when it's been a difficult balance. But Angela, who will speak now, has held the Ad Wellbeing task solidly and throughout, and she's going to bring it to life a bit. The main context I want to give you from my role within the Ad Wellbeing Service is that it's a service we're taking out into a much wider world, into organizations beyond the public sector. And our aim is to support organizations, businesses, and enterprises to understand and take action on how the ways they work specifically impact on the mental health of the workforce. So it's sort of akin to what Jenny was talking about, but in a way with a sort of narrower area of action. We're really thinking about mental health training, support, guidance, helping people to develop policy. It's that particular area of organizational life rather than the work that she's talking about taking place on so many different levels. What the work of the hub and Ad Wellbeing share is a focus and an understanding about how we feel as individuals when we have an experience of being part of something that is going well enough, where individuals feel valued enough, energized enough, frustrated enough, ambitious enough. And the other side of that, which is the impact that a group or organization that's not able to work well together can have on individual experiences of self-worth, of isolation, anxiety, loss of hope, or even, and not just in the current environment, of trauma. Well, I'm going to hand over to Angela now so that we have a bit more time to hear about the work that she's going to describe and her way of thinking about it.
Thanks, Lydia. As Lydia explained, we in Add Wellbeing have collectively shaped part of the service, and I think that's largely been through our experiences of the workplace wellbeing and clinicians by background. So Add ordinarily stands for Assessment, Design and Delivery, which takes a whole systems approach in understanding the individual experience within the organisation, but helping the organisation to make sense of some of those things that are being experienced, which, as Lydia helpfully mentioned, could be supported through policy, mental health awareness training, thinking about relationships and parts of the organisation that might be experiencing stress. So I guess I want to talk about kind of what made me interested as well in working for Add Wellbeing over 2 years ago. And there are a number of reasons, one of which I think is largely to do with my experience of being a mental health nurse for the last 20 years and having a training in a kind of humanistic approach. And since then going on to traverse different systems within the organisation, not just in the NHS, but third sector and local authority too. Working across the continuum of mental health and having the awareness that really it should be on par with physical health, but is not, and that stigma still exists, and something I'll speak to in a moment. I think the other part for me is the other awareness, which is our body systems. You know, our mind and body are connected, and that our mind is in our body, which seems obvious for some, but often not. Often people will report physical ailments as reasons for not going into work, when really the underlying issue might be about mental health. So when the advert came out calling for expressions of interest, I saw it as an opportunity to be part of something creative and collaborative, and the possibility of supporting an application of emotional literacy within organisations and supporting access to support when needed. More importantly for me, my sense of the project at the time, which has since evolved to be a more substantial service, was not about pathologising the organisation or the individual, but instead working in a more relational and humanistic way. And the second reason I suppose I put an expression of interest was due to my own experiences of mental health. And in 2014, I spoke at our Trust Time to Talk event, which was led by Paul Jenkins, our Chief Executive. And I was part of the panel, along with other health professionals, in discussing mental health, our mental health, and working in this organisation. And I was also reflecting on a previous experience whereby I'd been redeployed and then made redundant, which unfortunately followed a significant mental health episode, which was about a period of insomnia and high anxiety, which resulted in me calling in sick. Though it was in an organisation that was dealing with high anxiety, we were working with very deprived families and had a caseload of about 45 patients I had, which felt like an impossible task. When I reflect on some of the decision-making processes by senior managers at that time, it's apparent to me that, and this was written in black and white, that I was perceived as no longer being able to work in mental health. My sense of the senior leaders at that time was that they thought they were doing the right thing. I think they had to witness a senior nurse in recovery and see my fragility and vulnerability, I think was too painful and possibly mirrored something of their own vulnerability, that of the organisation, amongst other feelings too. So the stigma of mental health and what it means, I think, is often there within organisations, but I think it's also about vulnerability and fear of being left with something, as well as Jenny helpfully put, being an easy receptacle for to be not protected but open to further projections and other difficulties that may be happening in the organisation. But I think as the time has gone on, I also believe in the strength it takes to be with our vulnerability and through it stand in our own personal power if that feels comfortable to do. If we can accept that mental health is on a continuum, then we can accept as human beings that are going to have off days and that they're going to be difficult days too. I'm reminded by Professor Paul Gilbert, the founder of Compassionate Focused Therapy, who, when discussing the building of a compassionate mind, says that we need to be with the pain and suffering, pain and suffering as part of our human existence, the awareness of that, which requires an acceptance. And this, of course, is taken from Tibetan Buddhism. And I suppose I want to add to that, that we as human beings know that we're likely to experience loss, possible trauma throughout our lives, and that there is a possibility for growth, resilience, and post-traumatic growth too, of which is a process. Interestingly, throughout this pandemic, in the work of wellbeing, I've seen more vulnerability being expressed, and I think this is in response to our collective distress and trauma of COVID-19. Speaking with one of our clients in the charity sector about their personal experiences in a one-to-one consultation, they felt able to speak about vulnerability and then decided in discussion with me that they wanted to go and speak about this in a group that was to follow beyond the consultation, which I was also a part of. So being curious with them about this, about what would it mean for them to speak as a senior executive, it was clearly put to me that that person saw themselves as being situated at the top of the organisation and that they struggle too, and that it's really okay not to be okay, and that they wanted to be able to model that to the rest of the organisation. And so it did come to the group, and I think it role modelled something of an openness in the hierarchy, self-compassion and outward compassion, as well as an interest in the collective coming together in the group that opened further conversation about difference in the organisation, a diversity of thinking about what might be needed for individuals, which then resulted in some pragmatic approaches for the group in going forward. It kind of also reminds me of a title I came across recently, which was stated as being thinking collectively about a collective problem. And I have to credit the work of Lucia Helena Abdallah, a clinical psychologist, family therapist and narrative therapist that I had the pleasure of interviewing recently as part of our online digital academy course. We spoke about the work that she'd been doing with communities in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where distress was prevalent amongst people. And her approach was in the awareness that change and support requires collective minds coming together, and that this really can't be done alone. So when I think about moving beyond the pandemic, I think about global issues such as mental health, racism, climate change, to name a few, that of course have existed before. And I hope that we can build an awareness with regard to wellbeing as being on par, if not related to other initiatives, knowing that we cannot thrive in the workplace if there is no space for dialogue with one another, and instead be seeing it as a collective need within our society, whereby collaboration, creativity and transformation can be made possible. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So thanks very much to all our speakers. In just a few minutes, really, I think you'll agree that we've had a wide range of ideas and thoughts and some really fantastic personal insights into the experience of wellbeing in the workplace, and specifically from the personal level, but also how that personal experience has been impacted by the whole system. So we started with Jenny, who asked us to think about what else is going on when we're experiencing difficult situations at work, and thinking up a level. And also the need to not just think about the relational issues, but also which she called the organisational scaffolding, the structures and processes that are as important as the relational issues. Lydia then talked about the experience of system wellbeing at a system level, and the efforts that are being made at the moment to address the well-being of 80,000 workers in health and social care across North Central London, and the pushes and pulls between the individual and the system as people struggle with the need to do something differently, and are challenged to think about treating the system rather than just treating the individual. And finally, Angela, speaking very personally and drawing on her range of experience, but also suggesting that we think about well-being as a global issue, and that 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 requires the same kind of interventions that we currently are thinking about in terms of things like climate change and race. And what an amazing place to leave us with. So we're going to stop now. We're going to have a few minutes for you to have a comfort break, and we're going to come back at 7 o'clock to move into our panel, where Brian Rock will be our chair and will introduce the panel, and I'll step in as a panel member. So do turn your cameras off, but don't disconnect, and go and make yourself a drink and reflect on what you've heard and think about the questions and comments that you want to make. So before I go, I'm going to say thank you to our panel. What fantastic presentations, and a great way to kick us off this evening. Thank you, everybody.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Rock. I hope you can hear me. I'm seeing some thumbs up and some nods, which I'm very appreciative of. I'm just going to give people a few more minutes to get back from the brief break, and then we can continue with part 2, which I'm very much looking forward to. Okay. So I'm really delighted to be facilitating the next part of the evening and the event. I'm very pleased to welcome you back. As Chris mentioned, this is a sort of second of 2 events, although there's a sort of loosely connected arc. I see some familiar faces from the event, but also many new people who I'm really pleased to have joined us tonight. I am also really delighted to welcome to the panel, joining Chris, Jenny, Lydia and Angela, Christine Mackenzie, who is a senior leader at the Royal College of Nursing, who is also a psychodynamic psychotherapist and an NLP neuro-linguistic programming master practitioner. I'm really delighted to have Christine join us, and looking forward to hearing what she has to say. And also being joined by Elisa Ray Simpson, who I work very closely with and have the pleasure of. Elisa is the Deputy Director of Education and Training at the Trust. She's also a social worker by background and an adult psychoanalytic psychotherapist. She's a member of the British Psychoanalytic Council and also has been the chair of their Professional Standards Committee. So I'm sure you are looking forward to hearing from all of our speakers. And I just want to say that I'm especially pleased to be having a role tonight with this particular panel on International Women's Day. I really have the pleasure of really working with such a excellent, passionate group of women leaders. And we've already heard such sort of varied perspectives and varied views and experience, and also some emerging common themes. So in terms of the, just sort of some of the kind of housekeeping just going forward, just to help with managing the discussion is, if you would like to speak, we're trying to in a way bring in your views, your participation, your voices. If you want to speak, please, if you use, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions button. I think hopefully if you click on that, you're able to raise your hand, and that will then stay up until I actually see it. I've got the help from Gazelle from our communications team also to just help make sure that I cover people. By all means, also use the chat. I'm not going to take it for granted that you want to speak if you make a comment in the chat. Some people just want to express their views, but I will do my utmost to reference the things that are being said. I'll keep an eye on the chat as the time progresses. I just want to make one reflection while I can see people have already sort of started to get engaged, and that's really welcome. I mean, one reflection for me, I think, in terms of, in a sense, the development within our own organization, in line of what people have been saying from our speakers, what we've heard, is, I think, in a sense, a much greater awareness of the importance and salience of workforce. And I say that having come into my role in 2015, very focused on developing and delivering, quality, high quality learning experiences to students, obviously the individuals working in organizations and then systems. But I think certainly over the time that I've been involved in and noticed a sort of real shift in the organization's perception of its place in the system, and also in relation to our purpose and our contribution to the development of organizations and systems and the workforce. And so I'm really also delighted to, and I want to just reference this because I imagine people will speak to it, but over the last sort of 3-4 years, we've established a national workforce skills development unit. And I think our Deputy Director, Ian Tegadine, is with us as well in the audience. And that's really, I think, moved the TAVI much more centrally into considering and contributing issues around workforce support, workforce development, obviously connecting with organizations and systems too. So for me, that's part of that framing in a way that I think we might actually find helpful as we move forward. So I'm just now going to scan the Zoom and see if people have raised their hands. I noticed you've written something up in the chat, and I don't know if you want to speak to it. There's a lot in what you're saying. If you do, if you could let me know by just raising your hand, or indeed sort of unmuting your mic and coming in. Elisa, did you want to?
Yes, I perhaps I'll just kick off with a few comments from what we, very rich presentations we had, and also in response to one of the comments in the chat from, I think, Anne Simon about a framework. And I was very fortunate to be involved in the working with the unit in the development of the workforce stress and a supportive organisation framework. And some of the things that Angela, Jenny and Lydia referred to were really resonated with, in a way, what was at the heart of trying to put this framework together, which of course we engaged with an expert reference group that was very wide and very representative of different organizations. And it is the question about how do we manage resilience or stress or vulnerability, and really looking at the question of the system and the failure, I suppose, of the over-reliance on relying on individuals, and some of the things that or the kind of unfair burden really that gets placed on individuals, and some of the things that were talked about in terms of what does vulnerability look like? What does resilience look like? And how can we know about them? Because in a way, what we heard was about, in order to be able to actually manage the emotionally demanding and psychologically demanding nature of the work, it necessarily evokes a lot of anxiety and distress, and it's an emotional experience. And in a way, as a system, sometimes that is managed in different ways. So, for example, coping may look like just staff keeping quiet and just sort of quietly kind of crying in the sluice cupboard or somewhere and not sharing, and that may look like coping. But actually, it's trying to reframe resilience into thinking that it's about being able to know about those experiences. And in terms of the framework, I think what's really very helpful about it, and we can talk a bit more about it if there's time, there's something about enabling or facilitating the conversations that, in a way, also, Jenny also talked about, between different aspects of an organization, between structural and procedural aspects, the culture, the emotional culture of an organization, the individual within that, or even the position of teams within an organization. And I know that because I used to work in a team that worked with learning disabilities, and as if somehow the team had poor status within the institution, and it reflected something about how people feel about learning disability and how those things get reflected in an organization. So there's something about a framework that would enable and facilitate safe conversations about things that feel, really very distressing and get located in different places. And the importance of being able to have conversations that in a way are legitimized in an organization and across the organization, that it's not just within a team, but how to have the conversation across an organization. But there's something about how do we facilitate conversations? How do we know what good looks like? How do we know what coping looks like? And what might we need to do to get there together, really, and how to pose, a level of reflection and curiosity that would get us there. And I think that was very vivid in the descriptions that came in the talks earlier.
Thanks, Elisa. I just want to check, do you want to speak to your point that you made a little earlier?
Sorry, Brian, was that for me?
No, sorry, Elisa. Just there's a comment in the chat that I got a steer about, but I'm not sure that that's. I think, Martin, you've put in the chat something that I think is also really interesting for us about the panel. Does the panel have an example of an organizational structure or system that has proven effective in improving staff well-being? And so I wonder if somebody wants to kick off with that in a way, and perhaps Christine, I can ask you, because I know you've also had a lot of international experience, and maybe at some point could come in with actually some of the push-pulls that have been spoken about, some of the developments you've noticed that have worked elsewhere, and indeed whether they would also work here or indeed have been adopted here and to good effect.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, like Elisa, I'd very much like to echo my thanks for the presentations that we heard this evening, and to build on what we've already heard. There's so much richness there. And I think one of the things, well, there were several things that I might want to talk to, is that what we were seeing was an uncertainty and fear. And what we have found that has been valuable across the 4 countries is to be able to host what we would have called listening events. And I think initially the first port of call is really just to be able to hear people's experiences. So offering that space so that people can speak freely, without the sense of feeling that we have to do anything and have to respond. People seem to have been able to be mobilized by just giving that space. We've seen that particularly in health and social care, because as our panelists alluded to, when you're working within health and social care, you do expect death, but there's just been so much that people have found it very difficult. They haven't been able to see beyond it, but these events we know have given people the opportunity just to feel refreshed, to feel heard, but also to be able to keep on going. And so what I would be thinking about in response to what I'm hearing in some of the chat is, how do you offer the workforce the opportunity to be heard, but not feeling that you have to respond or have a response, so simply being heard. I think the other thing that I want to give a voice to is in relation to organisations and systems, is where the workforce may not be completely connected to an organisation. And I'm talking about agency staff, people who are transient, that come and go. And again, what we've been able to see from the work that we've been doing is again where we've been able to give a space to people to talk about their concerns and how they can connect to the workforce, particularly during the pandemic. We've been able to see people work much more comfortably within their roles and turn up. So I think it really is important. Yeah, I think frameworks are really difficult, but some of the things that I think have worked is, and they're small things. So whatever it is that we are thinking is, how can we do something that's small but consistent? And I would say that some of the work that the Royal College of Nursing has been doing around hydration, so ensuring that people get breaks, and also being able to focus on well-being. So we've got a health and well-being tool which supports people in the workplace. So I think it's keeping it small but being consistent, and something around visibility. I'm going to end there and just see whether there's any response to that, and then I can pick up a bit later on.
Thanks, Christine. I just also want to draw attention. I'm turning my video on and off because I'm having some difficulties with my connection, and I don't want to sort of drop out entirely. Please forgive me if you see my screen go back. I am here. Can I bring Chris in as well on this? Because Chris, I know you've got some really interesting views on approaches and what to draw on as well in frameworks.
Thanks, Brian. And there's lots that I could say, and just thinking about the John's question and Martin's question, and what Christine has just said. When we were developing the workforce stress and resilience framework, we commissioned a systematic review of the literature because we wanted to find out, so when it works, what does it look like? And I'm really sorry to say that we weren't able to answer that question because the literature is very limited. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. And some of that is about an absence of the right kind of research, but some of it is because it's such a difficult challenge. And I think I'd reflect on what Lydia said about the changing context. The problem is and I always ask the question, what matters to me? What matters to me today to make me feel like I am thriving at work will change over time. It might change tomorrow if something happens to me tonight, that what I want from my work and what I need from my work tomorrow might change. And I'm different from the person next to me whose needs are also changing. And on top of that, of course, the context is always changing. So I think it's incredibly difficult to kind of think about a framework and put something in place. So the scaffolding that Jenny was talking about, it's a sort of, I suppose, constantly evolving scaffolding that needs to change all the time and needs to be flexible enough. Maybe bamboo scaffolding is the answer because it needs to be flexible to be able to respond to the changes in the context. So I think it's really hard. Famously in the NHS, Professor Michael West has written a lot about this, and he talks about compassionate leadership and a framework for that, and he talks about the ABC. And I think the A is about acknowledgement, and it's about acknowledging the individual in the situation, and the second one is belonging. So I feel acknowledged, I feel like I belong and that I'm bothered about. And the third one is compassion. So I feel like somebody cares about me. And so I think they are small things, but they're so hard in many ways as well. So I think that's important. And just John, you talk about what about when patients and staff are living in the same space. And I just reflect on some work that I'm involved in at the moment about violence in inpatient mental health settings and the impact that has on the people that work there and live there, and certainly the work that we've done in co-produced with staff and service users. It is about not hiding away from each other, but from coming together in relationship and and acknowledging what it's like to be together, even though that might be really difficult at times, but not shying away from it, which I think often people do because they don't feel they have the confidence or the competence to engage. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we are trying to work through at the moment.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to invite Lydia. Lydia, do you want to possibly draw in the wider workforce and perhaps move sort of beyond also, you know, the public sector in a way? And
yes, and actually I can see that there's a question in the chat that's come about exactly that. I mean, it partly came to my mind when Christine was talking about you know, people sort of connected to an organization in a more dispersed way. You know, example was of agency work, and it made me think about a couple of clients that we've worked with in the wellbeing context, when it was only when we went in with a specific eye to thinking about mental health rather than their organizational structures, but actually saying, no, we're all just thinking about mental health here, that actually what they were able to speak about were the particular challenges for staff working, as it were, off-site. So people working in you know, with a remote connection to the main organization. So I suppose, I guess what I'm feeling is that, you know, I think our approach, one way of thinking about it is that you try and create a framework, and I guess in organizations where there's a degree of perhaps shared agreement across a system about how they want those frameworks to look like in an NHS integrated care system, for example, then you could have a sort of framework that was built in exactly the way that the stress and resilience framework's being talked about. But I guess in individual organizations under the kind of pressure that I think Lisa's identifying, where, you know, there's a business model and there's a need to be, you know, to be productive. I think one way of thinking about it would be to work with the framework that there is and to say, okay, this is your framework. This is how you are working. If you turn your attention to the way that way of working is impacting on the mental health of your staff, that what can you do about that might be a place to start. So it might be more at that point about the quality of the way that things are approached, rather than the sort of something a bit more quantitative like a framework. And I think increasingly our hope is anyway that organizations that do rely on funding or turnover, you know, will be interested in the legal, moral, and financial reasons that there are to kind of work to improve the mental health of the workforce. So it's a slightly different way of approaching it. I think some of our clients would be very resistant to the idea that they needed to change their frameworks for functioning, but they can get interested in doing something that they can think of as just being about mental health. And it starts small. And it's maybe a bit of a different ethos, perhaps, than the way that we approach things within the public sector. But I'd be very interested to hear what other people have to say as well, because Jenny might have another idea with her significant organizational experience.
Thanks, Lydia, and it's really helpful that you mentioned Jenny, because I was going to come to you, Jenny, because I thought, particularly in what you were saying, you were really drawing attention to the importance of thinking systemically in a way, and not getting too, in a way, focused in on an individual team or an individual. And often blame can be located in individuals or parts of organizations that actually move us away from really seeing where the issues are. But it's interesting, you know, there seems to be a thread through some of what's being said in the chat as well, and in what's being said in all the responses, of how you sort of balance that in a way with the fact that, you know, as an individual, one feels like one has a basic human need, as Anne says here, to be heard, to listen and be seen, the human side of work. Relating that in terms of what could be a creative tension, but also could be a kind of split, as I think you were drawing out.
It is a reality, and how difficult it is when you're in a very senior leadership position of a company or a public sector organisation, and you're faced with cuts or market pressures, and you know that you've got to make cutbacks and redundancies, and you're trying to create a psychologically safe, safe space that's trying to, support people through. a process of which you're held responsible, and I think it is deeply challenging. I suppose it was in a way to Martin's point around the example of an organisational structure and system, that, as everyone's describing, there is no one structure or system that will work. And what we can do is only to create the conditions for that. So something about, what is the minimum requisite structure that we can have to contain people in the midst of the very difficult experiences and changes and threats to the system, and how do you have a containing management system and good visible leadership and robust performance and psychological safety. But I think it is very difficult for leaders and at a particular level to hold both the anguish and pain of what they're having to do and the hard reality. And what they can do then is get cut off from that. And so what I think is really important is for them to create a space where they can honestly connect with that and then be able to think through rather than sort of project it down through the system and leave it left with others throughout the system. I know from trying to introduce change in a big organisation or a sort of major transformation and a sort of strategy shift, that the people that were most resistant and argumentative and defensive and angry about it, I had to really do some work to think what it was that they were telling me about the experience of everyone and the experience of myself, my own experience in leading that. And so I think that how you create a space for the leaders to stay connected to the difficulty and the challenge, but also to think about what's the minimum requisite support that they can offer to their staff in the context of a system over which they don't always have complete control.
Thanks, Jenny. There's some really interesting comments, quite sort of complex and photos. I see your hand. I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to come back to you. But in a sense, there's a comment by Lisa, and there's something about, in a sense, I think, if I can summarize it hopefully accurately, there's something about, I suppose, drawing out a potential inevitable sort of paradox or tension at the heart of an organization. I mean, you're drawing here on the voluntary sector, where you say there's huge volume of staff there working with populations in pain. And my experience is that the employer is driven by a business model in order to be economically viable to their founders. And that's, I mean, particularly so through the pandemic, we know just how hard hit the charitable sector has been. There's something that Shay also then, just above Lisa's comment, brings in around actually something to do with the fact that people have really suffered. And I might actually ask if you want to comment on that, but I suppose maybe bring in Angela, because all the work you're doing within the space of ad well-being, does Lisa's comment resonate with you in terms of that sort of that tension, that conflict in a way, and then how do you reconcile the organizational business purposes with actually the importance of the well-being of the workforce?
I think something that we've noticed in ad well-being, Lydia and I, is that in kind of working at kind of our message and going out to organisations, is that there is obviously the return on investment being the main draw that gets organisations in, but I think what we've really seen actually is the moral aspect of it, which is about the value on return. So actually some organisations already being interested, of course, in things as they happen. And I think Lydia spoke to the experience of an organisation that we work with, whereby there was a kind of significant experience of someone in the organisation becoming quite unwell, and actually the organisation needed to make sense of that. And I think that perhaps that affected them in a way that they felt they needed some support in being able to think about it, and actually had the courage to be able to do that, recognising that it was something they couldn't do alone. So I think it pulls on a number of things, and I think often what we see is that the impetus is unfortunately on the financial. It's often held within HR, it's often held mainly in HR, if I'm honest with you, because that's where funding is often held within when it comes to wellbeing. But actually some senior leaders and chief execs being curious as well about how they think about their organisation going forward, as well as managing change. You know, the awareness that restructuring and the effects that that has on the organisation is going to impact staff's well-being. So how can they somehow slightly cushion that in a way, or make sense of that by being able to think about it? And so I think there's a number of, I guess, things to draw on that might make the argument for support, but often it is the financial, unfortunately. But I also think there's something of the moral that's there, and I think the majority of organisations we work with, that seems to be the strongest thing that comes through, actually, interestingly. I also want to say as well that I'm really conscious about the idea of frameworks, and I think they can be really useful, but I also wonder about the possibility of it also shutting something down. In fact, you know, if there was a kind of a quick process that or a system that an organisation could use, my fear or my worry would be that it would be a quick fix. And I suppose, you know, we wouldn't put elastoplast on a gaping wound. You know, I feel that there's something about really being able to be with and alongside organisations. And I think with Add Wellbeing and what we're trying to create, it's about creating an alliance with the organisation, actually, and really being willing to listen and hear. I think Christine talked about that as well. And so, yeah, that'd be my take on it.
Can I follow up a bit there, Brian, if you don't mind? Because I think one of the messages in the chat, and I value what you've offered, Angela, I want to build on that, has been around the time for listening, and then, as I've perceived it, the time for action, and specifically in relation to discrimination. And so I want to really talk about the return on investment or value that we place, because what we do know in terms of health and social care is that when you do the staff survey is a good indicator of how patients and their families perceive care. So that's a really important barometer. But I want to speak and maybe share my own story, which is around gaining confidence. How do we talk and how do we bring our experiences of discrimination? I know that 2020 has really changed the landscape and has offered an opportunity for us to have those conversations in a more open way, but yet still very difficult and challenging. And I think it was Angela or Lydia who said, learning from the gaps. Well, discrimination has been a massive gap that's been going on for years, but 2020 has given us an opportunity to sit with the pain and to be able to refocus. My sense, my personal sense is, and I'm so open to be challenged, to be supported, but I'd love a comment. But my personal sense is, how do we together develop a language around discrimination and race that is useful? It isn't for me as a Black woman or the Black man or the white person. It really is about how do we do this together? Because what I have seen and witnessed in my life as I've grown up is that we can't do this on our own and in isolation. If we can create meaningful conversation where we have to sit with the pain. So as a white person, you may need to sit with some difficulty, annoyance and defense. And me as a Black person, I might need to have that moment where I can jump up and down and, you know, whatever it is that I need to do, but we're together in whatever it is that we are doing. I know, my belief is that we will create sustainable change. If we jump too quickly to action, what we will get is that sticky plaster. You know, we're going to try and just patch over it. There are a number of initiatives going on. I'm more conversant within London, but we know in society where we can show up and make a big difference. And I would urge you to look for those opportunities where you can have small group conversations, large group conversations, and sit with it and then think, so what can we do that will make a difference? I have experience of doing this myself personally, but professionally. And if I'd got permission, I would have shared those stories with you. But I know from being in a mixed group, Black and white people, I have learned and I've grown We can't do it in isolation. So we have to do that searching ourselves. I'm happy to be challenged, but if you want sustainable change, that comes from being together. That will give you outcomes that change and transform organisations. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Christine. No, thank you. And I saw Angela, Lydia and Jenny particularly sort of nodding, and I just want to check if any of them if want to come in, because I think, Shay, your comment is really important, and I think it's helpful for us also to make a bit of space to none, and perhaps not to move off too quickly, although I will bring in Fotis next. You've been very patient, but just let me check if anyone else on the panel wants to come at this point about this very important area for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely concur with that. I think it's such a difficult thing, and I think what's really, I think somebody in the chat used the word, you know, sort of demoralizing, is to see the sort of the speak about it, the aspirational speak around change and this, and actually it is difficult and it is challenging. And I think leaders in organizations who want to create this space have to have their own space in order to be able to do that work, where they can you know, get it wrong and be open, and you know, because they're so often at the front, having to lead, to sort of be at the front, be sort of, you know, the front singer, I don't know what it's of the band, but actually they haven't really done the work necessarily, and it's difficult work. And I agree that it's about having those conversations, and less about that, and the internal work and the slow steps than the sort of attitudes and aspirations that could then get people back up and feel like, you know, everyone knows what the right thing to say is, but we don't really know how to do it.
Brian, can I say something?
Please, yes, I was on mute when I was inviting you, please.
It's a slightly different, I mean, I completely agree with what's been said, and I was just thinking about something from a slightly different angle. I was doing some research for a course on trauma in the context of the workplace, and one of the studies I came across was an American study on racial trauma. And I think it's really important. I can see the problem with doing something that sort of pathologizes people's experience, but even just knowing that there's a way of thinking about trauma and the and racism and the microaggressions that take place in the context of a possibly sort of highly racialized developmental experience, it's another way of saying, you know, that there is a kind of evidenced reality and a significant mental health impact of something that we need to try and change. So it's a different tack, but I think there might be different ways of saying that this is something that is serious and needs the kind of conversations people are talking about. And there's also a sort of recognition of the sort of psychological impact for some people, even if it isn't traumatic for everybody. So I just wanted to speak to that, because it was a study I found, you know, by looking hard, you know, it wasn't obvious to me.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. Angela, I wasn't sure if you wanted to comment at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christine's speaking to what I feel as well, actually. You know, I feel that something that I've had to kind of be with, perhaps last year in the first lockdown, actually, when there was a kind of, you know, the awareness of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement was in the fore. It felt to me that whereas before, as someone of an ethnic background, it wasn't the done thing to talk about race, all of a sudden the door swung wide open, actually. And not only was it swung wide open, it was done in lockdown. We were in lockdown, and I think I had to revisit actually some of my experiences of trauma of a racial nature, in particular in the organisation. Actually, it was actually in my experience of working in organisations, and things that I had never really processed came to the the front of my mind. And I realised then that there was obviously there's a collective experience of racism and trauma, of course, but there was something about being in an organisation where I just hadn't processed those experiences, and I was having to be in contact with them in a way that I hadn't been before, and really make sense of them. So for me, there was a kind of a moment that I had, I think, last year, and I'm still making sense of now, really. So yeah, I relate, and I actually take on Christine's point about it really is about having a conversation. I don't know if anybody went to the obviously the trust as part of the centenary. We had the kind of event called Whiteness, a Problem for Our Time. If anybody watched that, I know Lydia, you were there, and that was by Helen Morgan, Jungian analyst who used to be was from what was originally the BAP, but is now the British Foundation of Psychotherapy. And what struck me, having watched that afterwards, was just the idea of having a conversation actually seemed almost such an impossible thing. It was like actually there was this invitation for people in a group being white to have a conversation, but then there was this other aspect of actually let's have an integrated conversation, and it being important that there be room for that felt really important. But at the same time there was a kind of a hesitancy and a reluctance, but I could see the importance of integrating this together. So just wanted to echo that really. Thanks, Brian, Christine, everyone else.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing in that way. Fotis, you've been very patient and you're asking a very interesting question. You've posted in the comment, but you've also raised your hand, so I'm going to invite you to speak to it in your own words. You'll just need to unmute. There we go.
When the presentation started, you asked to think of an organization might have felt,
Sorry, Fotis, could you just speak a bit louder? I'm struggling to hear you, and others might as well, just so we can really take in what you're saying.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect, thank you.
In the beginning of the presentation, you spoke about experiences whereby we felt we're an organization where we're able to grow. And, it was really kind of caring and holding us and allowing us to develop. And I feel I had that experience a few years ago, working for a charity, actually. And what I think was at the core of that, because we're working with kids at the very extreme of mental health presentations along the lines of conduct disorder in the community, what was at the core of the organization was that the care that we were required to show to these kids was replicated at all levels within the organization. So, for example, it was a place where we got free hot food for lunch. That food was sourced by a charity that was saving food from supermarkets. So, when you hear that model, initially you might think, oh my God, this is unreal, right? Or we were getting the choice of having massage twice a month. Again, when I was speaking to other colleagues in other services, they were really getting angry with me instead of saying, no, you should get the same for you. Actually, it really helps you for you to sleep at night after a month of hard work. We were getting supervision every week. So there is something about really, really and truly being cared for and having that experience. And I feel that maybe, yes, it has to do partly with money. And I'm sure these models are out there, but maybe because of costs, they are not being advertised. But that has to do with the external bit. So in motivational theory, there's the external motivators, which is about the physicality and the context of your work and your basic needs being met. But there is also the internal motivators, which is, this organization allowed us to develop in directions we found useful. So we're able to explore new models. It was also non-hierarchical. Mostly it had a flat hierarchy. So we really could contribute to the organization, and everybody had a voice. And we felt that we're part in like a cutting edge organization that was trying different things out, and experimentation was allowed. And we felt that we had a place and we fulfill a need. So it's both internal and external motivators, I think. And I think this notion of care at all levels of organization needs to be looked into further, because when I speak to consultants, for example, they tell me, well, I don't need to be careful. But actually, we all do in some capacity, perhaps not in the same way. But for example, you need to be cared for by, if your admin staff is going on maternity leave, is somebody ensuring that somebody replaces her or her before she goes, and there isn't a gap, because that will impact on your team and your service. So it could be something as like that, and I think that needs to be looked into further, I think, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. And I'm going to bring Elisa in, but I just want to also reference Ray's comment, actually, which actually follows on from Fotis's, and in the chat you can sort of scroll, as I'm getting very used to by time. So it's around sort of 7:20, because it almost, in a sense, to my mind, Ray, kind of gives a bit of a sort of the other perspective in a way of staff not being valued, because I think, Fotis, you're drawing out really direct experiences of feeling cared for, and actually organizational creativity in a way, the use of a wider system. So Elisa, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I think it is very much linked to I was thinking the comment that Ray made about, in a way, the circumstances where kind of caring isn't possible, actually, because you're saying when you know, there's a manager who can't bear to know you know, that there is distress somewhere in the organization or in a team, which in a way it's tantamount to, you know, it is tantamount to care, because in a way you're saying you had a manager, Fotis, who's or an organization who's able to know about need. You know, you're able, you needed to eat, you needed to, you know, to feel cared for and thought about. And I think there is something about in also in reference to the kind of models that organizations have, for example, of even thinking, you know, when you think about authority in an organization, and how we all kind of need to know a bit where we stand and who's doing what, and this clarity of tasks. But when is it that model of authority becomes a very rigid model that doesn't allow to learn from experience? So there's something about how could you have a model that would allow for, in a way, proper holding, a bit like thinking about the bamboo scaffolding or a carbon molecule that has the kind of flexibility, but can listen. And I think there is something about being in a position to interrogate, actually, to really question, to really have curiosity. And I think something that Angela referred to was almost the knee-jerk reaction to push to a framework that will be about kind of closing down an inquiry, as it were, closing down a process of knowing. So it's just a quick solution. And I could imagine that there are situations, and well, I think I'm pretty certain there are situations where it feels overwhelming to actually know about certain things, or to feel that actually if we just let a group of staff actually kind of come out with what they're really thinking, how we're going to hold on, you know, how are we going to manage that? You know, are we going to be overwhelmed by it? And then there is a sort of, you know, send staff off to some training or some well-being model that's just going to kind of quickly address that, but really not address it. It would be the plaster that we've been talking about. And there's something about how can we introduce a way of thinking, because we're not going to have the solutions, and every organization will be different. And for example, you know, different anxieties will be felt at different levels, and they're not just going to be about money. They're also going to be about what does anxiety or vulnerability or need, you know, kind of mean to particular people in different aspects of the organization, and they have perhaps competing needs too. But there's something about how can we have a way of thinking that will allow us to tolerate, or perhaps even the mention of the state of unwell-being. You know, how can we tolerate the state of unwell-being, and then to be able to think about it, because it's something about the level of curiosity that we have to be able to sustain. And in that sense, that needing a whole organizational approach, because it can't just be located in one team. But there's something about having to think about human needs, you know, beyond just the question of, you know, whether you're thirsty or hungry, which are, you know, or able to sleep, you know, have time with your family. I mean, those are basic needs, but there's also being able to have a thoughtful and meaningful place at work, which is about belonging, and that you know, people can bear to know you at work, at, you know, in the fullness of you as a human being, as it were, which is in a way what's the experience that you were talking about, and addresses perhaps, you know, Ray's comment about in certain circumstances knowing becomes unbearable. So this having to think about how could we find a way of thinking that would allow knowledge of that kind to be tolerable and not be used in a constructive way and not become overwhelming. So that's what it, you know, your question, but well, both your questions made me think of that.
Thanks, Elisa. Let me invite Chris in as well. Chris, I think you have some interesting reflections on this.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, there is so much to say, isn't there? There is so much to say, and I'm just thinking about how to respond. And I suppose I'm thinking two things. So I have a role, as well as my role at the Tavi, for 2 days a week. I am the chief nurse for the North London Integrated Care System. And I started my role in September, and it was meant to be a strategic kind of, you know, I don't know, blue skiesy type role, really. But as it became quite clear that we were heading into another wave of the pandemic, it suddenly changed, and I was responsible for working alongside 9 chief nurses from the NHS, plus their colleagues in primary care and social care, to try and our medical colleagues and our allied health professionals and managers, to try to find a way that we could bear what was coming again. So, you know, we'd had the first wave, people were just getting back onto their feet, really, and then before we'd even put into place all those support mechanisms, really, that was supposed to help people get back, you know, kind of recover, we were into it again, and it was much harder, and it came much quicker, and and we knew that it was going to last much longer in terms of, you know, short up the peak and a very slow coming down the other end, particularly for our intensive care units. And I felt really helpless, and you know, it wasn't, you know, I was back in acute care, it wasn't my place. I felt very helpless, but what I did was I brought the chief nurses together every day, and every day we met for half an hour, and if one of them didn't join, then I would text them. We had a WhatsApp group, we were talking all the time, because none of us knew really what to do. And what we decided to do in the end, we kept being asked, can you not come up with a staffing levels? Can we flex the staffing levels? Can you write something down? Can you tell the staff how they should stretch the staffing levels? And we just kept saying, no, we won't do that, because we can't do that. It would just be the wrong thing to do. And in the end, what we did, and I know people thought we were it was a really risky thing, but we wrote a letter. We wrote a letter to every single nurse and allied health professional, asking them, you know, acknowledging what they were going through and acknowledging what they were going to be asked to do, and recognizing how difficult that would be for them, but telling them that we were there, and we were, you know, we were there, and it went down really, really, really well, and in fact the rest of London followed suit with it, but it wasn't, you know, and I had a text from a friend of mine, not connected from with work, and her, where she shared me a message that her niece had sent to her, and she said, I've just read the letter written by, you know, signed by your friend Chris. It's helped me get through this weekend. And this was a physio who'd been sent into intensive care again to be part of the proning team in the intensive care unit. And I just thought, you know, that it's that you can't always, for me, it's you know, we have to support people to do really difficult stuff, really, really difficult stuff, and we can't fix it. But there is something about it's that scaffolding, isn't it? That knowing that somebody just knows that you're doing it. And I think that's a big little thing. I think it was a tiny thing we did, but I think for me, that's about how a system can hold people and help them to do something that nobody really wants to do, but we have to. So I guess for me, that just as an example of kind of how we might act at system level, really.
Thank you, Chris. Talking about things you don't want to do, I have what I would say is the unenviable task of actually bringing this event to a close quite soon. And it's very difficult because it has been such a sort of engrossing, interesting, complex mix of comments and reflections and questions and contributions from our panelists, from you, the participants as well. And I fear that I will leave tonight's event feeling in some way like I've failed, because actually there is just so much richness, and I really hope people have had the opportunity to read the comments through the chat. I think it's Tara who talks about, staff well-being as a radical concept. I mean, that's just extraordinary, really, that actually in the world today, maybe in some respects, COVID has as difficult and challenging, and it's been in many respects, sadly, for a lot of for so many and lots of other people with privilege and being spared actually some of those very significant challenges. But actually also the OFS, the Office for Students, which is the newish higher education regulator, just released a report on digital learning through this pandemic, and they call it Gravity Assists, the way in which actually digital learning, etc., has actually been given a boost enabled by the COVID pandemic. And perhaps in some way, the whole issue of well-being in the workforce and actually bringing the organizational aims together with the need to actually care for and look after people is getting some assistance too. I don't feel like I actually can do it justice to sort of, in a sense, draw out some kind of key themes. There's so many. So what I want to do is ask each of the panelists in turn to sort of, I suppose, have an opportunity for a kind of their last word in a way, reflections on what they will, in a sense, take with them from the event. Hopefully all of the participants, and you've really been fantastic, we'll also have a whole host of other reflections you'll carry with you as well. I hope we're going to actually save the chat, and Chris, we might in a way think of doing some kind of a blog in a way, building on actually the sort of what's been, I think, an extraordinary, multi-voice conversation. So I'm going to start, Jenny, with you, because I'm going to, just to keep my bearings, go in sort of the order of the speakers and then bring in Christine and Elisa and Chris. So maybe in sort of, 30 seconds or so, sharp, quick, off the mark.
Yeah, I wanted to just sum up what I took from this was just how frameworks and models and interventions make something that can be very difficult, very accessible. And at the same time, what we bring from the Tavistock to these frameworks and to these models and these various interventions is a capacity to work with it by holding in mind that there are unconscious processes at play in the system that we have to help surface and manage, and that it is a system, and that we must pay attention to all parts of the system and the interconnections within it, rather than just focusing on where we think the difficulties or problems sit around within it, and to think about the whole gamut of what it means to run a healthy organisation. And I just fantastic conversation, and likewise we'd love to continue more, but that's probably my takeaway from this.
Thank you, Jenny. Lydia.
I just had a couple of thoughts. I mean, just to echo what people have said about the richness of the conversation and all the directions we could go in. I think I had two thoughts. One was the kind of tendency I think we can have to think that the people that are impacted on by the difficult things that we encounter in our organizations and systems are just the people who are perhaps in more of their roles managed rather than managers and leaders. So I think there's a risk of forgetting that actually everybody in a system or organization is exposed to an emotional experience when things are difficult and complicated. And so I think there's something about holding on to the difficulty of managing and leading, as well as the difficulties of following and leading at the same time. So that was one thing. And then the only other thought was, that I'm really interested in how we import what's fantastic about our way of thinking that does come from within a public sector structure into language and ways of approaching things that make sense to people who are not working in that structure. So I suppose those are the two things I'd be interested to keep talking about with people.
Thank you, Lydia. Angela.
Thanks, Brian. I guess for me, I'm really struck with the understanding of compassion, really, and one being compassion to self, but actually outward compassion too. And I think, like Lydia was saying, there's different parts of the organisation and people represented in different parts of those organisations, and it feels to me that everyone should be valued, irrespective of what their role is. And I think sometimes it's just even the way that we speak to each other. I mean, I've been in organisations where just the way conversations are had, and this could be even in a senior leadership team, I think there's something about how we value and make space to really be with each other. And I think there might even be something about holding the tension as well of difference and diversity in thinking. And I think what we've done today is we've been thinking collectively about this issue. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who contributed.
Thank you, Angela. Christine.
So I'd like to end with learn from the gaps, sit with the pain, and be curious about what it means to be human.
Super. Elisa.
Been really brief because I agree with everything that's been said, but it's about being able to create spaces for people to feel understood and listened to, and to make meaning together in a way of what we hear.
Chris.
Wow. So to sum up, I think I'd go back to what Christine said about actually, so organizations and systems, I think somebody said, are made up of people, human beings, and with who are all very different, and in ways we can see, in ways we can't see, and I think we're all in this together, and and we create organizations, we create systems through the way we behave and relate to each other, and I believe in collective action, and I also believe that what goes around comes around. And so in every act, think, how would I experience this my interaction if I was on the other side of it? Is that how I would want to be treated? And if the answer is, yeah, I think so, and also kind of thinking about, also constantly being open to multiple perspectives on a single issue, so that kind of multiple simultaneous experiences of the same thing, and trying to speak from the other person, think from the other person's perspective, always drives me in my work, and so I would offer that.
Thank you, Chris. My last reflection, which partly is with the awareness that we've gone a little bit over time, so I do appreciate people staying the course and beyond. I suppose it's something about being reality oriented, and also, approaching things with a degree of candor, with kindness. Because to my mind, some of the comments in relation to some of those tensions and struggles are also about organizations that can be candid with the challenges and the opportunities. And I think sometimes, I think people really appreciate that, rather than some of the sort of attempt to kind of, in a way, distract from what's really going on. Well, I just want to say thank you again to all of our wonderful speakers, panelists, my chair, and having the opportunity to work with Chris again in the second event. I also very much want to extend a very big thank you to Gazelle and Glenn, who've been supporting quietly but very effectively in actually setting up these events, communicating about them, and actually helping us to run the events successfully. Gazelle, I think you're going to post very quickly a link or two to the forthcoming events. We are coming to the end of our centenary festival with online events. There'll be other things to follow, no doubt, once we're sort of beyond the celebratory period. But again, I just really want to thank everyone. It's been really super, and it certainly lifted my spirits, although also given me a lot more pause for thought too, which I hope is something of your experience as well. Thanks very much. Good night.